Andre Williams walked through the hallways of Lincoln High School the same way he did every morning. Head down, backpack slung over one shoulder, trying his best to blend into the crowd of students rushing to their first period classes at 16. Years old, Andre had perfected the art of being invisible. Lincoln High wasn't like his old school back in the city. Here in Millfield, a quiet suburban town about an hour outside of Chicago, Andre was one of maybe 20 black students in a school of nearly 2,000. The move had happened 6 months ago when his mom, Diana, finally got the nursing job she'd been dreaming of at Millfield General Hospital. She'd worked double shifts at 3 different places just to make ends meet back home, so when this opportunity came up, there was no question they had to take it. "It's a fresh start, baby," his mom had told him while they packed up their small apartment. "Better schools, safer neighborhoods, this is our chance." Andre understood why they moved, and he was proud of his mom for getting such a good job. But understanding something and feeling good about it were two very different things. Back in Chicago, he knew everyone on his block. He had friends he'd grown up with since kindergarten. Here in Millfield, he felt like he was living in a completely different world. The students at Lincoln High weren't mean to him, exactly. They just didn't see him. He'd sit in class, answer questions when called on, and turn in his homework on time. His grades were solid, mostly B's with a few A's mixed in. Teachers seemed to like him well enough. But when the bell rang and everyone scattered to their lockers or headed to lunch, Andre found himself walking alone. During lunch, he'd usually grab his tray and find an empty table near the windows in the cafeteria. Sometimes he'd bring a book. Sometimes he'd just eat quietly while watching other students laugh and talk with their friends. He'd see the football players at their table, the theater kids at theirs, the art students clustered together comparing. Sketchbooks, everyone seemed to have their place except him. "You should try joining something," his mom would say when he came home each day and she asked about school. "Maybe a club or a sport. That's how you make friends." Andre would just nod and change the subject. How could he explain that it wasn't that simple? How could he tell her that when he walked into a room, conversation seemed to pause for just a moment before continuing? Not in a mean way, but in that awkward way that happened when people weren't sure what to say or how to act. The truth was, Andre missed music more than anything else. Back home, he spent most of his free time at his grandmother's house, just 2 blocks away from their apartment. Grandma Rose had been the pianist at Mount Olive Baptist Church for 43 years, and she'd been teaching Andre to play since he was 5 years old. "Music is the language of the soul," she'd always tell him, her weathered hands guiding his small fingers to the right keys. "When words fail you, baby, let the music speak." Grandma Rose didn't have money for fancy piano lessons or expensive sheet music. But she had patience, wisdom, and an old upright piano that had somehow stayed in tune despite its age. Every day after school, Andre would walk to her house, do his homework at her kitchen table, and then spend hours at that piano. She taught him hymns first. "Amazing Grace, How Great Thou Art," and "Blessed Assurance." But as Andre got older, and his skills improved, Grandma Rose started bringing home different kinds of music. She'd find old jazz records at garage sales, classical music CDs at the library, and even some contemporary songs she'd hear on the radio. "Music is music," she'd say with a smile. "Don't matter if it's Mozart or Mahalia Jackson. If it speaks to your heart, it's worth learning." By the time Andre was 14, he could play just about anything. Classical pieces that would challenge students at expensive music schools. Jazz standards that would impress professional musicians. Gospel songs that could move a congregation to tears. And when he was feeling particularly creative, he'd sit at that old piano and play whatever came to his mind, letting his fingers find melodies that seemed to pour straight from his heart. But here in Millfield, there was no piano. The apartment he and his mom rented was nice enough, but it was small and definitely didn't have room for an instrument. Andre had looked into the music program at Lincoln High, but it seemed intimidating. The music teacher, Mrs. Henderson, was known for being strict, and most of the students in band and choir had been playing together since elementary school. Andre didn't think he'd fit in there any better than he did anywhere else. So instead, he kept his musical abilities to himself. Sometimes when he was doing homework in his room, he'd tap out melodies on his desk or hum quietly to himself. But mostly he just missed the feeling of sitting at a piano and letting the music flow through him. His mom noticed, of course. Mothers always do. "I know you miss playing piano, honey," she said one evening while they were eating dinner. "Maybe we can save up and get you a keyboard or something. I know it's not the same as Grandma Rose's piano, but—" "It's okay, Mom," Andre had replied, not wanting her to feel guilty about something that wasn't her fault. "I'm fine." But he wasn't fine, not really. Music had been such a big part of who he was back home. It was how he expressed himself, how he dealt with stress, how he found joy in difficult times. Without it, he felt like he was missing a piece of himself. As weeks turned into months at Lincoln High, Andre settled into a routine. Go to class, eat lunch alone, walk home, do homework, help his mom with dinner, watch TV, go to bed, repeat. His teachers seemed satisfied with his work, and his mom was happy with her new job, so Andre told himself that this was just how things were going to be. Maybe some people were meant to blend into the background. Maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. He had no idea that everything was about to change in the most unexpected way possible. That a single moment of what seemed like public humiliation would actually become the turning point that transformed not just how others saw him, but how he saw himself. All because of an old piano sitting on a stage and a principal who thought he was making a harmless joke. The day started like any other Friday at Lincoln High School. Andre grabbed his usual breakfast of toast and orange juice, said goodbye to his mom as she headed off to her morning shift at the hospital, and walked the 12 blocks to school. The October air was crisp, and the leaves were starting to turn those beautiful colors that made Millfield look like something out of a postcard. But today felt different somehow. There was an energy buzzing through the hallways that Andre couldn't quite put his finger on. Students seemed more excited than usual, talking in animated groups by their lockers and checking their phones more frequently than normal. It wasn't until first period that Andre remembered what was happening. Mrs. Patterson, his English teacher, reminded the class that today was the annual Fall Talent Show assembly during fifth period. "I know many of you are excited about the performances," she said with a smile. "Just remember that we'll still have class afterwards, so try to contain your enthusiasm until then." Andre had completely forgotten about the talent show. Every year, Lincoln High held this big assembly where students could showcase their talents. Singing, dancing, comedy acts, magic tricks, poetry readings, pretty much anything that could entertain a crowd of teenagers for an hour. Andre had never paid much attention to it before. Back in Chicago, his old school had similar events, but he'd never been interested in participating. The idea of getting up in front of hundreds of people made his stomach turn. As the morning went on, Andre noticed more and more students talking about their acts. In his second period history class, he overheard two girls discussing their dance routine. During lunch, a group of boys at the next table over were practicing what sounded like a comedy sketch. Even some of the quieter students seemed to be involved in group performances. Andre ate his lunch alone as usual, but today he found himself actually curious about what would happen at the assembly. He'd never seen any of his classmates perform before. Maybe it would be interesting to see this different side of people. He only knew from sitting in class together. When fifth period finally arrived, the entire school filed into the massive auditorium. Andre found himself a seat toward the back, in his usual spot where he could observe without drawing attention. The auditorium was buzzing with excitement as students filled every seat. Teachers stood along the walls, and he could see some parents who had come to watch their kids perform. Principal Davidson took the stage and tapped the microphone to get everyone's attention. He was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair, and the kind of authoritative presence that made students automatically sit up straighter when he walked by. "Good afternoon, Lincoln High," he called out, and the crowd responded with cheers and applause. "Welcome to our annual Fall Talent Show." We have some amazing performances lined up for you today, so let's give all our brave performers the respect and encouragement they deserve. The show began with a group of senior girls performing a perfectly choreographed dance routine to a popular song. They were followed by a junior who played guitar and sang an original song he'd written. Then came a comedy duo that had the entire auditorium laughing so hard that even the teachers were wiping tears from their eyes. Andre found himself genuinely enjoying the performances. These were his classmates, people he saw every day in the hallways, but up on that stage they seemed like completely different people. Confident, talented, comfortable in the spotlight. He wondered what that must feel like, to have that kind of courage to share something personal with so many people. About halfway through the show, something went wrong with the sound system. A group of sophomore girls had just finished their singing performance when the microphones started making that awful screeching feedback noise that made everyone cover their ears. The stage lights flickered on and off a few times, and then everything went quiet. Principal Davidson came back on stage looking flustered. The tech crew, which consisted of a few students from the audiovisual club, were scrambling around trying to figure out what had happened. Andre could see them plugging and unplugging cables, pressing buttons on equipment and shaking their heads in confusion. "We're having some technical difficulties," the principal announced, his voice echoing strangely without the microphone. "We're going to need a few minutes to get this sorted out." The students in the auditorium started getting restless. Conversations broke out all over the room, and Andre could sense that people were getting bored. Some students pulled out their phones, others started fidgeting in their seats. The performers who were waiting backstage looked nervous about the delay. Principal Davidson was clearly feeling the pressure to keep the energy up. Andre watched as he scanned the auditorium, probably looking for something, anything, to fill the time while the tech crew worked on the sound system. The principal's eyes moved across the rows of students, and Andre could almost see him trying to come up with an idea. That's when those eyes landed on Andre felt his stomach drop. He'd been in this school for 6 months, and he was pretty. Sure, the principal had never really noticed him before. He was just another face in the crowd, another name on the attendance sheets. But now Principal Davidson was looking right at him with what appeared to be sudden inspiration. "You know what?" the principal said, his voice carrying across the quiet auditorium. "While we're waiting for the sound to get fixed, why don't we have some impromptu entertainment?" Andre hoped desperately that the principal was talking to someone else, looking at someone else. But Principal Davidson was definitely staring in his direction, and then he was pointing right at him. "Andre Williams!" The principal called out, and suddenly hundreds of heads turned to look at Andre. "Why don't you come up here and play something for us on the piano?" The blood drained from Andre's face. He could feel every pair of eyes in the auditorium focused on him. Students he'd never spoken to were craning their necks to see him. Teachers were looking in his direction with curious expressions. Even the performers backstage had poked their heads out to see what was happening. Andre's heart was pounding so hard he was sure people could hear it. This had to be some kind of mistake. The principal couldn't possibly be serious. Andre wasn't in the music program. He wasn't signed up to perform. He was just a quiet kid who minded his own business and tried to stay invisible. But Principal Davidson was still looking at him expectantly, with that same smile he used when he was trying to encourage students to participate in school activities. The silence in the auditorium was becoming uncomfortable, and Andre could hear students starting to whisper and giggle. "Come on, don't be shy," the principal continued, clearly thinking this was all in good fun. "We've got this beautiful grand piano up here just waiting to be played. Let's see what you've got." Andre's mouth went completely dry. He looked around desperately, hoping someone would save him from this nightmare. But all he saw were faces staring back at him, some curious, some amused, some already starting to smirk as they anticipated what they assumed would be an awkward moment. The principal was still waiting. The entire school was watching, and Andre realized with growing horror that there was absolutely no way out of this situation without making it even worse for himself. For what felt like an eternity, Andre sat frozen in his seat. The whispers around him were getting louder, and he could hear scattered giggles from different parts of the auditorium. Some students had turned completely around in their seats to stare at him. Others were nudging their friends and pointing in his direction. What's he waiting for? Someone behind him whispered, not even trying to be quiet about it. This is embarrassing, another voice said. And Andre wasn't sure if they meant embarrassing for him or embarrassing to watch. Principal Davidson was still standing on the stage, microphone in hand, maintaining that encouraging smile that adults use when they think they're being helpful. Come on, Andre, he called out again. Don't keep us waiting. I'm sure you can play something. Andre's hands were shaking. His mouth felt like cotton. Every instinct in his body was telling him to just get up and leave. Walk out of the auditorium, go to the bathroom, hide in the library until this whole thing was over. Let people think whatever they wanted to think. It would be embarrassing for a few days, maybe a week, and then everyone would forget about it. But then he heard Grandma Rose's voice in his head, as clear as if she was sitting right next to him. Music is the language of the soul, baby. When words fail you, let the music speak. Andre closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He thought about all those afternoons in his grandmother's living room, her patient hands guiding his fingers across the keys. He thought about the old upright piano that had been his best friend for over 10 years. He thought about how music had always been there for him when nothing else made sense, and suddenly something shifted inside him. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the memory of his grandmother's faith in him. Maybe it was just the realization that running away would hurt more than staying. But Andre found himself standing up. The auditorium fell silent immediately. Every conversation stopped. Every phone was lowered. Everyone was watching as Andre slowly made his way down the row of seats, mumbling "excuse me" to the students who had to pull their legs in to let him pass. The walk down the aisle to the stage felt like it took forever. Andre could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes following his every step. His sneakers squeaked against the floor in the quiet auditorium. When he reached the front, he realized he'd have to climb the steps up to the stage, which meant everyone would be looking up at him. Principal Davidson was beaming now, clearly pleased with himself for getting Andre to participate. There we go, he said into the microphone. Let's give Andre some encouragement, folks. A few people clapped politely, but it was the kind of weak applause you give when you're not sure what you're applauding for yet. Andre could tell that most people were just waiting to see what would happen next. Some probably expected him to sit down at the piano and plunk out chopsticks or happy birthday. Others might have been hoping for something more embarrassing. Andre climbed the steps and walked across the stage toward the grand piano. It was beautiful, a glossy black Steinway that probably cost more than his mom made in a year. He'd never played on anything this nice before. Grandma Rose's upright piano was special to him, but this instrument looked like something you'd see in a concert hall. Take your time, Principal Davidson said, finally stepping back to give Andre some space. Andre approached the piano bench and sat down slowly. The auditorium was so quiet he could hear his own breathing. He looked out at the sea of faces staring back at him and felt that familiar wave of panic rising in his chest, but then he placed his hands on the keys, and everything changed. The piano was perfectly in tune, and the keys responded to his touch like they were made for his fingers. Andre closed his eyes and let his hands find their way to a comfortable position. For a moment, he forgot about the hundreds of people watching him. He forgot about Principal Davidson standing nearby. He forgot about being the quiet kid who didn't fit in. He just thought about the music. Andre started softly, with a simple melody that his grandmother had taught him years ago. It was an old spiritual, something she used to hum while she cooked dinner. His left hand found the bass notes while his right hand picked out the gentle tune. The piano's rich sound filled the auditorium with warmth. He could hear the shift in the audience immediately. The restless shuffling stopped. The whispers disappeared. Even without opening his eyes, Andre could feel that he had their attention in a completely different way now. As he grew more comfortable, Andre let the music build. He added harmonies that his grandmother had never taught him, chord progressions that he'd figured out on his own over the years. The simple spiritual transformed into something more complex, more personal. Then, feeling a surge of confidence he hadn't expected, Andre transitioned into something completely different. His fingers moved into the opening notes of a jazz standard. Autumn Leaves, but he played it his own way. Slower than the original, with a melancholy twist that spoke to all those lonely lunch periods and quiet walks home from school. The auditorium was completely silent except for the music. Andre opened his eyes for the first time since he'd started playing and saw faces he'd never seen before. Students who usually looked right through him were leaning forward in their seats. Teachers along the walls had stopped what they were doing to listen. Even Principal Davidson was standing perfectly still, his encouraging smile replaced by something that looked like genuine surprise. Andre let his hands move across the keys with increasing confidence. He played runs and arpeggios that made the piano sing. He added his own improvisations, letting the music tell the story of his last 6 months in Millfield. The loneliness, the homesickness, the feeling of being invisible, but also the hope, the love for his mother, the memories of his grandmother's lessons. As he neared the end of the song, Andre slowed the tempo and brought the volume down to almost a whisper. The final notes hung in the air like a question, beautiful and haunting and completely honest. When the last note faded away, the auditorium remained completely silent for what felt like several heartbeats. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, someone started clapping. The single clap came from a girl in the third row. Andre couldn't see her clearly from where he sat at the piano, but her applause cut through the silence like a bell. Within seconds, the person next to her joined in. Then the person behind them. Like ripples spreading across a pond, the clapping spread throughout the entire auditorium, but this wasn't the polite, obligatory applause that students usually gave during school assemblies. This was something different, something real. Andre could hear the difference in the sound. People weren't just clapping because they felt like they should. They were clapping because they genuinely couldn't believe what they had just heard. Within moments, the scattered applause had grown into thunderous clapping that echoed off the walls of the auditorium. Students were getting to their feet, one by one, until the entire crowd was standing. Andre had seen standing ovations on TV and in movies, but he'd never been on the receiving end of one. The sound was overwhelming, almost physical in its intensity. Andre sat at the piano bench, still not quite believing what was happening. His hands were still resting on the keys, and he could feel the vibrations from the applause through the instrument. He looked out at the sea of faces, and for the first time in 6 months, people weren't looking through him or past him. They were looking directly at him, and their expressions weren't blank or dismissive. They were amazed. In the front row, he saw his chemistry teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, shaking his head slowly with a huge grin on his face. The man looked like he couldn't quite process what he'd just witnessed. 2 rows back, Andre spotted Jennifer Chun, a girl from his math class who had always been friendly but never really talked to him much. She was clapping so enthusiastically that her whole body was moving with the rhythm, but it was the faces of the students who had never paid attention to him before that really struck Andre. Kids who walked past him in the hallways like he was invisible were now staring at him with something that looked like respect. The football players who sat at their own exclusive table during lunch were on their feet applauding. The popular girls who never seemed to notice anyone outside their circle were cheering. Principal Davidson stood off to the side of the stage, looking like someone had just told him that gravity worked differently than he'd always believed. The confident smile he'd worn when he called Andre up was gone, replaced by an expression of complete shock. He was clapping too, but Andre could see something else in his face. Was it embarrassment? Regret? The principal had clearly expected this to be a harmless bit of entertainment, maybe even a gentle joke. He definitely hadn't expected to witness something that sounded like it. Belonged in a professional concert hall. The applause continued for what felt like forever. Andre had no idea what he was supposed to do. Should he stand up? Should he bow? Should he say something? He'd never been the center of attention like this before, and he honestly had no clue about the proper etiquette for receiving a standing ovation. Finally, the noise began to die down as students gradually took their seats again. But the energy in the room had completely changed. Instead of the restless, slightly bored atmosphere that had filled the auditorium before the technical difficulties, there was now an electric feeling of excitement. People were leaning forward in their seats, looking at Andre like they were waiting for him to do something else amazing. Principal Davidson stepped forward, clearly trying to regain his composure. He walked over to Andre, who was still sitting at the piano, and put a hand on his shoulder. "Well," the principal said into his microphone, his voice carrying that slight shakiness that happens when someone is trying to sound casual after being completely surprised. "I think it's safe to say that was unexpected." A few people laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that comes from nervous energy rather than actual humor. Everyone could tell that the principal was just as stunned as everyone else. "Andre," Principal Davidson continued, "I had no idea you could play like that. How long have you been playing piano?" Andre looked up at the principal, then out at the hundreds of faces still watching him. His mouth felt dry again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the surreal feeling of suddenly being the most interesting person in a room full of people who had never given him a second thought. "Since I was 5, Andre said quietly. His voice didn't carry well without a microphone, but the auditorium was so quiet that most people could hear him anyway. "Since you were 5, Principal?" Davidson repeated, shaking his head. "And you've never been in our music program?" Andre shook his head. "No, sir." "Well, I think that's going to change very soon," the principal said with a laugh that sounded more genuine this time. "Mrs. Henderson, our music teacher, is probably already planning how to get you into her advanced classes." From the side of the auditorium, Andre could see Mrs. Henderson nodding enthusiastically. She was a small woman with graying hair who had a reputation for being tough but fair with her music students. Andre had seen her in the hallways but had never actually spoken to her. Now she was looking at him like he was some kind of musical treasure she couldn't wait to get her hands on. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Principal Davidson asked. "My grandmother taught me," Andre said, his voice getting a little stronger. "Back in Chicago." "Your grandmother must be an incredible teacher." Andre smiled for the first time since this whole thing had started. She's been playing piano at her church for over 40 years. The principal nodded appreciatively. "Well, she clearly passed on some serious talent to you." He turned to address the audience. "I think we can all agree that Andre has given us something pretty special today." Another round of applause started, though not as intense as the first. This time Andre managed to stand up and give a small wave to the crowd. He still felt overwhelmed, but there was something else mixing with the shock now. Something that felt almost like pride. As he walked back across the stage toward the steps, Andre could hear students calling out to him. "That was incredible! Dude, you're amazing! I had no idea you could play like that." For 6 months, Andre had walked through the halls of Lincoln High School feeling invisible. Now, as he made his way back to his seat, he realized that he would never be invisible again. Every person in this auditorium would remember this moment. They would remember his name. They would remember that the quiet kid from Chicago could make a piano sing in ways that took their breath away. The technical difficulties had been fixed while Andre was playing, and the talent show continued with the remaining performers. But Andre could tell that nothing else was going to compare to what had just happened. Students kept turning around to look at him, and he could see small groups whispering and glancing in his direction. As Andre settled back into his seat, he felt something he hadn't experienced since moving to Millfield. He felt like he belonged. Walking into school the following Monday was like entering a completely different world. Andre had spent the entire weekend wondering if Friday's assembly had actually happened, or if he'd somehow dreamed the whole thing. But the moment he stepped through the front doors of Lincoln High, he knew it had been very real. "Andre," called out a voice from across the hallway. It was Tyler Morrison, one of the basketball players who had never so much as nodded at Andre. "Man, that performance on Friday was insane. I had no idea you could play like that." Before Andre could even respond, Tyler was joined by 2 other students from the basketball team. They wanted to know how long he'd been playing, where he'd learned, and whether he knew any songs by their favorite artists. Andre found himself having an actual conversation with kids who had been complete strangers just 3 days earlier. This scene repeated itself throughout the morning. In his first period class, at least 5 different students came up to talk to him before the bell rang. During the break between classes, people he'd never spoken to were stopping him in the hallways to compliment his playing or ask questions about music. By lunchtime, Andre's head was spinning from all the attention. The biggest change came when he walked into the cafeteria with his lunch tray. For 6 months, Andre had automatically headed to his Yule empty table by the windows. But today, as he scanned the room, he heard someone calling his name. "Andre! Over here." It was Destiny Washington, a girl from his English class who was known for being friendly with everyone. She was sitting with a group of students that Andre recognized but had never really talked to. They were waving him over to their table. Andre hesitated for a moment. Part of him couldn't believe this was really happening. But the smiles on their faces looked genuine, so he walked over and sat down. "We've been talking about your performance all weekend," said Kevin Park, a junior who was in Andre's history class. "Seriously, where did you learn to play like that?" "That wasn't just good, that was professional level stuff." Andre found himself telling the story of his grandmother and the old upright piano in Chicago. As he talked, more students drifted over to listen. Soon there were 8 people crowded around the table, all hanging on his every word. Andre had never been the center of attention like this before, and while it was still a little overwhelming, it felt good in a way he hadn't expected. "You have to join the music program," insisted Destiny. "Mrs. Henderson has been asking everyone if they know how to get in touch with you. She wants to talk to you about joining her advanced classes." Andre had been thinking about this all weekend. The music program at Lincoln High had always seemed so intimidating, full of students who had been playing together for years. But maybe it was time to step out of his comfort zone that afternoon. Andre found himself standing outside Mrs. Henderson's classroom after school. Through the window, he could see her organizing sheet music at her desk. He knocked softly on the door frame. "Andre?" Mrs. Henderson looked up with a huge smile. "I was hoping you'd come by. Please come in and sit down." Andre had expected Mrs. Henderson to be serious and formal, but she turned out to be warm and enthusiastic. She told him that in 23 years of teaching music, she had rarely heard anyone play with such natural musicality and technical skill. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said, leaning forward in her chair. "What you did on Friday was extraordinary. But more than that, I could hear something in your playing that you can't teach. You have a gift, Andre, a real gift." Mrs. Henderson explained that she wanted to create a special independent study program for Andre, one that would challenge him and help him grow as a musician. She also mentioned that the school district had partnerships with several music conservatories and colleges that offered scholarships to talented students. "I know this is a lot to think about," she said, "but I want you to know that you have options now, real opportunities." As Andre walked home that day, his mind was racing. 6 months ago, he'd felt like he was starting over with nothing. Now it seemed like doors were opening everywhere he looked. The changes weren't just about music either. Over the next few weeks, Andre found himself becoming part of a social circle for the first time since moving to Millfield. The group that had invited him to sit with them at lunch became his regular crew. They included him in weekend plans, invited him to basketball games, and genuinely seemed to enjoy his company. It helped that Andre discovered he was actually pretty funny when he wasn't worried about being invisible. All those months of quietly observing people had given him a sharp sense of humor that his new friends appreciated. He found himself making jokes and observations that had people laughing in ways that felt natural and comfortable, but perhaps the most meaningful change came from an unexpected source. Principal Davidson. About 2 weeks after the assembly, Andre was called to the principal's office. His first instinct was panic. Had he done something wrong? But when he arrived, Principal Davidson was sitting behind his desk with a look that wasn't stern or disappointed. It was apologetic. "Andre, please sit down," the principal said. I owe you an apology." Andre was confused. An apology? For what? For putting you on the spot the way I did at the assembly. Principal Davidson sighed. I thought I was just having a little fun, maybe getting a shy student to participate. I realize now that what I did could have been humiliating for you. I made assumptions about you without knowing anything about your background or your abilities. Andre thought about this for a moment. It's okay, Mr. Davidson. I mean, it worked out pretty well in the end. The principal smiled. It did indeed. But that doesn't make what I did right. I learned something important that day about making assumptions about students, about anyone, really. Principal Davidson went on to tell Andre that he'd been thinking a lot about that moment and what it had taught him about really seeing the students in his school. He'd decided to implement a new program called Hidden Talents, where students could showcase abilities that might not fit into traditional academic or athletic categories. You inspired this, he told Andre. Your performance reminded all of us that we never really know what amazing things people are capable of until we give them a chance to show us. By the time winter break arrived, Andre's life had been completely transformed. He was thriving in Mrs. Henderson's advanced music program, where he was learning new techniques and exploring different musical styles. He'd made real friends who valued him for who he was, not just for his musical ability. His grades had actually improved because he felt more confident and engaged in school overall. The biggest surprise came just before Christmas, when Mrs. Henderson told him about a scholarship opportunity at a prestigious music conservatory in Chicago. They were looking for talented students who showed exceptional promise, and she wanted to recommend Andre for their program. It would mean moving back to Chicago, she explained. And it's a very competitive program. But Andre, this is the kind of opportunity that could change your entire future. Andre thought about his grandmother, still playing piano at Mount Olive Baptist Church. He thought about his mother, working so hard to give him a better life. And he thought about that scared, lonely kid who had walked into Lincoln High School 6 months earlier, convinced he would never fit in anywhere. That kid couldn't have imagined any of this. But this new Andre, the one who had found his voice through music and discovered that he belonged wherever he chose to be, could imagine anything.